I'm a firm believer in the statement that you can't manage what you don't measure. And I think advanced metering infrastructure is an integral part of moving forward with water supply efficiencies. Not only does it allow customers to understand where their water is going, but I think as importantly or more importantly, the data that is received by the district in real time with respect to water flows allows the district to understand consumption on an ongoing basis and identify the areas of the network that are the critical priorities for maintenance and improvement. So we have a complicated network here with MMWD. I think 900 miles of piped supply. Very difficult to manage all of that. So in order to do effective maintenance, we have to understand where are the critical areas that require attention and prioritize that. With better data from AMI, it makes that much more possible. So I think in the long run, the investment in AMI will be more than paid off by both the efficiencies gained through leak reduction and the ability to target maintenance activities and maintenance funds. I think it's helpful to put desal in context. So earlier I asked, why is MMWD caught in a cycle of water shortages? 80% of our water currently comes from rain that we capture in our own reservoirs here in the watershed. The other 20% or so comes from rain that's sourced from the Russian River. So MMWD has two sources of water. That's it. Both are 100% drought susceptible. So as long as we continue to have all of our water coming from two sources that are highly drought susceptible, we will always be in this cycle of water shortage. We won't get out of this. Now, Jed alluded to all the different strategies we have to address different our water supply diversity. But I think sometimes it's easy to get caught up in the amount of complexity there is across all of those different supplies. Do we focus on expanded storage? Do we focus on groundwater banking in Sonoma? Do we focus on interties? Do we focus on desal? And it starts to create this analysis paralysis, which is actually, I think, what's happening at MMWD. We're in the midst of a very in-depth study to evaluate the costs and benefits of each of these options. And it's a repeat of the study that was done in 2017 that did a careful cost-benefit analysis of each of these options. We've got the data. I think we need to start thinking about how can we complement highly vulnerable water supplies with sources that are drought resistant. And when you look at that, you only have two options. You have wastewater recycling and you have desal. Now, I think to the question, the benefits of desal are striking in that it's drought resistant. There are obvious costs, downsides, the energy requirements for running it, the environmental consequences of concentrated brine. But I think we have to start to look at that and say, are the technologies now at a place where we are comfortable with some of the environmental issues to move forward and make that decision? If we don't do that, if we don't move to drought-resistant water supplies, we will not get out of this cycle of water shortages. I think there's the balance, Steve. I think there are options that we can and should pursue that are within our ability to do so on our own. Wastewater recycling is one of those. Expanding storage capacity to the extent feasible is one of those. There are other options that we should be considering, and I think we should be very open to that. That will be more difficult to pursue on our own. The obvious ones, as you've noted, are developing links to the state and federal water projects in the Central Valley. using underground storage as an alternative to expanded reservoir capacity. If we are able to do that, it's going to be in Sonoma, obviously. And then desal, I think this has already come up. Will the costs and benefits, if we do decide to pursue that, favor something that we do here on our own versus something that's done on a regional basis? I suspect once the current study is complete, we will have fairly good data for making those decisions about how to move on each of these options. But I think in the end, my perception is that it's going to be a balance between local initiative as well as a regional initiative. I think it's a little maybe early to make a firm conclusion regarding the benefits of doing desal locally here in Marin versus doing it in cooperation with a regional initiative. Now, I think for the reasons already noted, I don't know that Antioch connecting to the Antioch system is under a lot of consideration right now, but I believe the current study is doing careful comparisons of the costs and benefits of running a desal operation independently here in Marin versus trying to do new development through regional cooperation. Now, some of the costs and benefits have already been noted. Not only the capital costs, but the operating costs of the desal facility are going to be quite high. So if we did that independently, we would have to cover those. If we did that in collaboration, obviously they'd be spread out. But on the other hand, moving water is probably the most expensive aspect of water supply. I think that's the highest consumption of energy is actually moving water. So a desal plant that's at some distance from Marin could potentially incur costs that would make it less economically feasible than something that we did locally. So that's a lot to say that we should have the data on all of those options that allow us to make cost-benefit comparisons and guide a more informed decision, hopefully by the end of the year. I don't think we can underestimate the importance of conservation. I think it has to be part of our water management strategy going forward, but I think it's very difficult to promote conservation in a void. In other words, consumers that are continually asked to conserve without seeing parallel efforts to diversify our water supplies so that at some point there is a limit to conservation is critical. I also don't think we can conserve our way out of a drought. If the drought goes on long enough, we might buy a few extra months, but clearly that's not gonna be enough. And so conservation in conjunction with water supply diversification is I think critical. Your question about communication it really hits home with me because I decided to run for a board position when I realized in March that the board had gone against a staff recommendation to put a measure on the June ballot to allow for voter approval to allow renewed investigation of desal as a water supply opportunity. I just thought that was at the time that to not put that back to voters at that time was very concerning, and I didn't understand why. But that wasn't actually the trigger for me. The trigger was the discussion in the board meeting, and my opponent, Larry Bregman, said, well, it would be really confusing for voters if we went ahead with this because they're not really sure. There's a couple of, there was Proposition T that failed, Proposition S that passed, and voters wouldn't really be sure about what they're voting for here. So, we're not going to put it on the ballot. And the job of the board is to provide information to the voters in a way that's not confusing, in a way that they can understand, in a way that we can understand how decisions are made, and in a way that's fully transparent. And that was what eventually decided, that was the decision point for me, that I need to get, involved and see if we can just do this better. So as you've gathered, I'm really concerned about the quality of communication by that board. And I think that's one area that we can absolutely improve if given the chance. I agree that the water supplier is not responsible for managing housing and housing development requirements. The water supply, given this situation, if that state mandates remains in place, that increases the urgency on MMWD to establish additional water supplies, ideally that are drought resistant. It just increases the urgency with which we've got to move forward with expanding and diversifying our water supply. It is already a highly urgent situation. It is already critical. It just means we have to move even faster. We have to obviously understand what our targets are. Is it 3 years of available supply at all times, given the additional 14,004 houses that are projected? Then that's what we have to shoot for. But we just have to move very aggressively. I believe we lose about 11% of our water to leaks and some, non-payment of bills. That's actually a pretty good number for most water suppliers. I suspect that the state is going to start to push for a higher bar and trying to get water suppliers to come in at about 5% lost to leaks and non-payment. If we could reduce our losses by 5%, that would be one step towards a more sustainable supply. Now, we do have infrastructure challenges here at MMWD because of the assembly of a lot of different systems that were developed over a long time ago using different practices and materials. It's also a difficult geography, so we have extensive pipelines. I think we have almost as much as East Bay Mud, although we serve a much smaller population. So this again comes back to my argument for why we can use why we need technology to help us identify the most vulnerable areas and focus on and prioritize those. And I think advanced metering can really facilitate that. I really hope that a cost-benefit analysis of stormwater capture would promote it as a viable strategy for increasing our water supply here in Marin. I'm sure you're aware of the environmental requirements for water release in rivers and streams, which actually really also impacts our ability to expand our reservoir capacities because we have to maintain our compliance with Fish and Game for water release. So I would really hope that a good cost-benefit analysis would make it a viable solution to pursue. I haven't seen that data yet. I think it would be interesting to collect. I'll throw out one caution story. I work a lot in Singapore, and if you've spent time there, it rains every day at 3 o'clock. And despite that, constant rain, they have had to diversify. They're the leaders in wastewater recycling and water reuse, wastewater reuse for potable purposes, as well as desalination. So because their ability to capture enough of that water and store it, and ultimately is limited by their geography and by their infrastructure. So, that hasn't proven to be, sort of the overarching solution for Singapore. I hope it would be the case for Marin, but I just don't have the data for that. Everything that we need to do in order to bring MMWD out of this cycle of water shortages and towards a new vision of never being in a position of running out of water is going to be highly controversial within Marin. We know that every water supply solution that we're going to propose is going to have proponents and opponents fighting it out. Issues around rates are going to be, they have been very controversial. They will continue to be so. So I feel that in my first 100 days, the number one priority will be to try to bring all stakeholders to the table to reestablish a joint vision for what we think MMWD could and should be. That's how MMWD was started. Leaders brought the citizens of Marin together to invest in a massive amount of infrastructure that we are benefiting from now 100 years later. It's a luxury to be able to debate the pros and cons of desal when we have 7 reservoirs that were built by our predecessors. We need to come back to the mentality of working together to establish something that is going to benefit citizens of Marin 100 years from now, we have to recognize that we need to put some of our differences aside in order to achieve that. And so in my first 100 days, my number one priority would be to try to bring all of the different groups that are going to be actively engaged in every solution discussion, every rate discussion, to say, can we find a way to work together to achieve progress?